Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Paris. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department at the College of Staten Island, or CSI, as we say. And I'm also the director of a set of activities and programs we call the Legal Studies Institute. I'm going to start with 30 seconds about that. We offer a minor in legal studies. We offer one-on-one pre-law advising to all current students and graduates. We sponsor workshops on the LSAT and the law school admissions process and careers in the law. And we also, from time to time, at least once a semester, sponsor academic talks by scholars like this one. We've had some really impressive scholars in the past, and tonight will be no exception. I'm going to copy a link into the chat for our legal studies blog. You can subscribe to the blog. So when I post something, you'll get a notice about events. There's a subscription box there. Okay, so let me start with the authors. This is a terrific book. It's just out. It's a history of the constitutional framing and the amendments and the amendment processes, successful amendments, failed amendments. And it's a co-authored book, and both authors are here to talk with us tonight. John Kowal is a former director of grant-making initiatives at the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Institute. And for those of you who don't know, that's a big deal. He is currently vice president for programs at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, where he's responsible for coordinating and guiding the organization's programs on democracy, justice, liberty, and national security. He writes on issues of constitutional law and democratic reform. He's a graduate of NYU and the Harvard Law School. Wilfred Codrington III is assistant professor at Brooklyn Law School and a fellow at the Brennan Center. His teaching and scholarship focus on constitutional law, election law, race, and anti-discrimination. Prior to joining the law school, Brooklyn Law School, Codrington was an adjunct assistant professor of public service at New York University's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. He's a former associate at a law firm, DLA Piper LLP, and a former law clerk for the Honorable Deborah A. Batts. He's a graduate of Brown University, Penn's Fells Institute of Government, and the Stanford Law School. And I'm just delighted. And these authors are here with us for, frankly, a very modest fee, and as sort of a willingness to engage with you. They've come to talk about a fairly new book, hasn't been out very long. It's called The People's Constitution. 200 years, 27 amendments, and the promise of a more perfect union. And any academic would immediately develop blurb envy. Looking at the back of the book, we have praise from Congressman Jamie Raskin, historian and journalist E.J. Dionne, luminaries in constitutional law, Erwin Chemerinsky and Sandy Levinson, and even former Senator Russ Feingold. I'm going to read my favorite blurb, which is from Melissa Murray, who's a professor of law at NYU Law School. This is exactly correct. A carefully researched deep dive into America's founding document and its amendments, the People's Constitution injects color and life into constitutional history. At a time when so much of the American experiment seems precarious, the People's Constitution is an urgent and necessary reminder of the promise and the challenges of sustaining a government for and by the people. The book is beautifully written, deeply, deeply researched. If you teach American government or political history or constitutional law, it's an essential resource. And it was just a pleasure to read this book. And as luck would have it, John and Wilfred, did you see the New Yorker today?
Yes, we did.
Probably your inbox was exploding, right?
A few friends did point it out for sure.
I don't know. I don't know Jill Lepore. I read her. She's wonderful. I sent her an email right away. I want you to know that. I sent her an email right away with the link to the book. And I said, well, that line about nobody's looked at this, and there are others, right? I mean, there's Ackerman and Levinson and that, but anyway, I thought that was just a very strange coincidence. So I'm going to put the link to that article in the chat as well right now, because it's definitely relevant. And it based, boom, just today. So ground rules. We're going to have the authors, everyone else should mute. The authors will be unmuted and will be on speaker view. They're going to talk about the book for about 30 minutes, give or take 10, either way, it's up to you. And then I would like to use the chat for questions. I'll screen them, and then I'll call on the person whose question it is to unmute and ask and elaborate. I think it's more interesting that way, but no question gets asked until it goes through the chat and I recognize it. Okay, everybody mute except the authors. And thank you so much for doing this. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, for having us. We are truly delighted to be here. We love talking about this book. It's a book that we wrote. We didn't write it for lawyers and law students and professors. We wanted it to be rigorous, and so that the luminaries you mentioned on the back, that they would learn something from it and see that it was all credible and legit. But we really focused on writing it, for people who are not experts, because we really think it's important that the Constitution not be just something that experts think about and talk about. It's the people's Constitution. And we'll get into all of that, but we hope that our talk inspires you to pick up the book and read it. I think you'll find it a really interesting and powerful history. I want to say I'm doubly excited by this invitation. I mean, number one, I went to NYU as an undergrad, so it's always nice to meet NYU folks. I also grew up on Staten Island. I lived in Great Kills for my entire childhood. My sister still lives there. My sister got her master's in teaching at the College of Staten Island. My nephew Brian got his BA in engineering there. So I was, like I said, truly delighted to get this invitation. And I'm only sorry I can't meet you all in person. Wilfred, do you want to say hello before we kind of start our standard book talk?
Yeah, John's gonna start to talk, but I also want to just extend my appreciation for this invite. It is I was not born on Staten Island, but I am a tri-state area person from Bridgeport, Connecticut, but now an adopted New Yorker. Have been here for more than a decade, and I'm just happy to engage with students and colleagues and professors and anyone who wants to talk about the state of our constitutional democracy, particularly in this important moment. So with that, thank you again, and I would just pass it over to John, and he'll start, and I'll pick up from there if that works for you.
Great, thank you, Wilfred. So look, this is a book about something that most people think is impossible, amending the Constitution. And Jill Lepore's piece today said, gee, we really need this to fix our democracy. Too bad it's impossible now. And we're going to get into why this is a common lament throughout our history, but it's not the permanent state of our history. So we like to begin with a thought exercise. So I'd like everyone to picture a time in America when the country was sharply divided along regional lines, with the more urban East and Midwest pitted against the heartland in the South. I want you to picture a time when our politics was gridlocked, with very closely fought elections at the national level, with control of Congress switching every few years, and with 2 elections in a short period of time, where the Electoral College delivered the presidency to someone who did not win the popular vote. I want you to picture a time when immigration was changing the face of the country, bringing new vitality, but also stirring up anxiety among many people who feared that it would increase competition for jobs or other opportunities, or would affect or harm or destroy American culture. I want you to also imagine a time when innovative new technologies were transforming the way we communicate, the way we work, the way we live, making life more convenient, but also creating lots of problems for society and for democracy. I want you to imagine a time when economic inequality was increasing, where a wealthy few that were able to rig the system to their benefit, and where the wealthiest in America paid almost no taxes, and while the tax burden was borne almost entirely by working people and farmers. And finally, I want you to imagine a time when a conservative Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution in ways that restricted and eroded fundamental rights, blocked progressive reforms, and advanced the interests of corporations and the mega rich while ignoring those of the minority. Now, I can't see you. In the book talk, we would ask you to raise your hands if this all sounds familiar. But you may be surprised to learn that we're not talking about America in 2022. We're talking about America in 1899. In the America of 1899, there were many reformers who believed it was urgent to amend the Constitution to repair an ailing democracy. That year, in 1899, the Washington Post published an editorial that urged reformers to give up their foolish dreams of trying to amend the Constitution. I'm going to read a quote from the paper. "It is true," they said, "that there is some dissatisfaction with the Constitution as it is. This is shown by the frequent proposal of amendments and by the earnestness with which they are pressed on the attention of Congress. There have been demands made on Congress for the submission of a woman's suffrage amendment, an election of senators by popular vote amendment, and various other amendments. Not one of them has any prospect of getting over this almost impassable route. For that reason," the editors concluded, "we may properly conclude that the Constitution is unamendable." And I want you to remember that when you read Jill Lepore's piece, because it's the same sentiment, 123 years later. And yet, from that editorial in 1899, just one decade later, Congress approved the first amendment in like half a century. It was an amendment that would legitimize the income tax, which a right-wing Supreme Court had said was unconstitutional. By 1920, 21 years after this amendment, we added 4 new amendments to the Constitution, starting with the 16th Amendment that authorized the income tax, the 17th Amendment, which gave voters the power to choose United States senators. In the original Constitution, that power was reserved to gerrymandered state legislatures. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And there was also the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment. And we can talk about that because it sounds like a restriction on liberty and a kind of conservative amendment. But in fact, it was viewed as an important public health experiment in protecting people from the evils of alcohol. A half century later, in 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt was similarly pessimistic about relying on constitutional amendments at a critical moment in his presidency. Roosevelt was elected to address the crisis of the national depression. It's sort of hard to imagine today. A third of the country was unemployed. But Roosevelt kept trying to pass laws that would revive the economy, stir competition, get the economy moving. Time and again, the Supreme Court said that the Constitution does not give Congress and the president the power to do that. But as Roosevelt kept battling what he called the 9 old men of the Supreme Court, he was urged by advisors to basically settle the matter by promoting a constitutional amendment that would clarify that the federal government had these powers. But Roosevelt was unwilling to take that risk. And I'm going to quote again. It is of course clear, he said, that any determined minority group in the nation could, without great difficulty, block ratification by one means or another in at least 13 states for a long period of time. He, as we can talk about, he decided in this time of emergency that he was going to basically fight for a vision of the Constitution that is in fact what the framers' vision of the Constitution was, and that's something we can get into, which is, there's a kind of rise of this talk of originalism today, right? And people where it's important to only really look at the intent of the people who wrote the Constitution, but through a kind of sleight of hand, they try to suggest that the framers of the Constitution intended that we have a very limited, weak national government, which is far from the truth as we get into it. But I digress. So the pessimistic view about the possibility of amending prevails among experts today, even today. So In the book, we quote Professor Richard Albert, a tremendous scholar and a wonderfully nice guy who's been like a tremendous friend to us in this process. But Richard Albert will say that the US Constitution is best understood as constructively unamendable. It gives the impression that everything is freely amendable, but really, he says, nothing today is amendable. Professor Sanford Levinson, another, a legend in the legal field, also someone who has been very good to us, he argues that it's next to impossible to amend the Constitution with regard to genuinely controversial issues, even if substantial and intense majorities advocate that amendment. Now, this is a very understandable point of view. I mean, everyone agrees it's difficult to amend the Constitution. It's been a long time. It's been, 50 years since Congress last proposed a successful amendment. But we argue in the book that difficult is not impossible. As our book illustrates, and we wanted to go back to the history, that time and again, generations of Americans have overcome this same sense of powerlessness to put their imprint on our national charter through the amending procedure of the Constitution's Article 5. So I think we'll for a minute.
Our book, The People's Constitution, tells the story of how the American people have taken this imperfect document, this imperfect Constitution, a document that was both profoundly visionary, but fundamentally flawed, and how they molded it into their own. Their extraordinary labors, they made the Constitution more democratic. They made it more inclusive, and they made it more suited to the needs of a changing country through the amending process. And these changes have come primarily in 4 distinct waves, and they've arisen out of some of the most turbulent periods in American history. So, for example, the first 12 amendments, the founding era amendments, as we describe them, they addressed omissions in the original charter. Most notably, the lack of a comprehensive protection for individual rights and individual liberty. So we get the Bill of Rights there. The Reconstruction era, the amendments of that era promised a second founding in the wake of the Civil War. And these amendments, they abolished slavery, they guaranteed equal citizenship, and they sought to extend voting rights protections for Black men. At the same time, they imposed substantial limits on the states, these rogue state governments that had so long suppressed liberties and rights. In the Progressive era, which John just described, the amendment sought to grapple with basically a modernizing nation, but a nation that was also beset with corporate greed and public corruption. And they did this by authorizing the income tax and the direct election of senators and extending the franchise to women and outlawing the manufacture and sale and transportation of liquor, the Prohibition Amendment. And then we have the Civil Rights era. That was the most recent era of amendments. And though that era was decidedly less ambitious than past eras in terms of what they were seeking to accomplish, they still did something magnificent and monumental. They continued the expansion of democracy and voting rights to long ignored populations, as well as updating the presidential succession for the nuclear age. Now, some of these additions I mentioned have wrought profound changes in America's fundamental law. Other amendments, they're best described as technical fixes. But when we think about them in aggregate, when we think about the 27 amendments as a whole, it is no exaggeration to say that much of what we consider to be at the heart of our Constitution, the heart of our national charter, and really our national identity, these ideas from our cherished protections of free speech and religion to the essential guarantees of due process and equal protection of laws, these really come from not the beta version of the Constitution, but the periodic upgrades that the people have given it that now comprised 40% of the document. And nevertheless, most Americans today embrace the view of the Washington Post editors of 1899, the part that John just read. Many think that it's impossible to amend the Constitution. Some believe that it's unwise to tamper with the document. Some think it's even dangerous. we wrote this book as a response to these critiques. We wrote it in particular to hopefully inject a sense of optimism about the viability and about the value of advocating for constitutional reform through this largely neglected Article 5 process with democratic participation. So this is a plea to put aside the sense of defeatism and to recover our constitutional imagination. And we made this conscious decision to write this book in style and in substance to ensure its broad accessibility. This is not a book written solely for lawyers. It is not a book written solely for academics. In fact, our chief objective was to blend somewhat of a lively prose and rigorous history to reach a wider audience. So we were extremely pleased when Publishers Weekly praised our book, saying it had incisive character profiles, brisk historical sketches, and lucid analyses of legal and political matters that make for a fresh and invigorating take on the history of United States democracy. As the People's Constitution explains, while the story of our national charter began with the 1787 Philadelphia Confab, where you have 55 men in these powder wigs, half of whom were slave owners, they're hashing out this framework that's going to shape American experiment. It started there, but it did not end there. That was just the first chapter in a much longer story. And that's a story that continues to this day. As if we are in a long distance relay, they pass the baton to successive generations of Americans with expectations that they would continue the race, that we would continue the race. The framers of the Constitution were far more numerous and far more diverse than the men who gathered at the Philadelphia Convention and assembled in the various state ratifying conventions. They lived across more than 2 centuries and faced a plethora of existential crises. So we wanted to write this book to tell their stories because they're also our stories. And we believe that our stories, separately and collectively, in these stories, there is power. And there are important messages for every American who cares about the state of our democracy and rights today. And so in closing, I'm going to read a passage from the last chapter of our book, if you'll humor me for a moment. Perhaps no one has ever captured this process, and that's the Article 5 amendment process, more profoundly than Thurgood Marshall, the grandson of a slave who championed civil rights and then, in his later years, earned the distinction of becoming the first African-American justice of the United States Supreme Court. In 1987, as the nation marked the Constitution's bicentennial, Justice Marshall criticized the degree to which the celebration invited a complacent belief that the vision of those who debated and compromised in Philadelphia yielded a more perfect union, it is said, that we now enjoy. In a speech intended as a counterpoint to the gauzy festivities organized in honor of the framers' accomplishment, the justice offered a dissenting view, and I quote, "I do not believe that the meaning of the Constitution was forever fixed at the Philadelphia Convention, nor do I find the wisdom, foresight, and sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound. To the contrary, the government they devised was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and momentous social transformation to attain the system of constitutional government and the respect for individual freedoms and human rights that we hold as fundamental today. When contemporary Americans cite the Constitution, they invoke a concept that is vastly different from the framers barely began to construct 2 centuries ago." And the New York Times reported that Marshall's speech struck perhaps the most negative tone sounded this bicentennial year by so prominent a public official. It was a stark contrast to the lavish praise of the framers' wisdom and devotion to liberty and justice by figures including President Reagan and Warren E. Burger, who was a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But this criticism surely missed the point. Marshall was merely saving his praise for the many framers who came after, the men and women who fought to expand the narrow conception of we the people to produce a constitution that is more democratic, more inclusive, and more just. As Justice Marshall noted, and I quote, "The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 could not have envisioned these changes. They could not have imagined, nor would they have accepted, that the document they were drafting would be one day construed by a Supreme Court to which had been appointed a woman and a descendant of an African slave. We the people no longer enslaved, but the credit does not belong to the framers. It belongs to those who refuse to acquiesce in outdated notions of liberty, justice, and equality, and who strive to better them." Now, rather than encourage a blind pilgrimage to the shrine of the original document now stored at the National Archives, Justice Marshall urged Americans to seek instead a sensitive understanding of the Constitution's inherent defects and its promising evolution through 200 years of history. In so doing, Marshall promised, we will see that the true miracle was not the birth of the Constitution, but its life, a life nurtured through 2 turbulent centuries of our own making. And it was in this way, through periodic infusions of democratic energy channeled through the Article 5 amendment process, that the framers' Constitution became the people's Constitution. So that passage concludes our book talk, but John and I do hope that it will be the start of a bigger conversation tonight, and a bigger conversation more broadly. So with that, we want to thank you, and we look forward to having this discussion.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fantastic. Okay, everybody, the chat is available for any and all questions. And in order to give you time to formulate some questions, I'll begin with 1 or 2 if necessary. I could ask questions all night, but I'd rather not. I'll probably invite the authors out for a drink later this year and see if we can have a chat. So my first question, while people put your questions in the chat, please. I take it there's something important at stake for you as between mobilizations for formal Article 5 amendments and more informal, sometimes very wrenching, conflictual processes. So the chapter on the New Deal that you have is quite interesting. Ackerman's called it a structural amendment. It's a de facto kind of amendment. Then there's the ERA, which John has written about. There's sort of, Reva Siegel had an article about the de facto adoption. The ERA's principles were adopted through judicial interpretation. Is there anything terribly important at stake as between formality and informality for you?
I'll start, and John, if you want to jump in after.
Sure.
I'm actually working on a paper on this right now, and both those words, formality and informality, appear in the title, at least the working title. So really been thinking about this. Yeah, the way to think about it is the Constitution doesn't just change through Article 5. Article 5 does create the amending process where you need supermajorities in Congress and in the states to propose and amend the Constitution. But that is not the only way we amend the Constitution. And so when Professor Paris talks about these informal amendments, we amend the Constitution in various ways. And so the New Deal, we think about that as being an informal amendment because it totally revamped the way our government was structured. It added, most notably, a series of ABC agencies, all the agencies you can think about now, the SEC, FEC, FHA, all these agencies that help administer laws through the statutes that Congress passes, right? And so it creates, if we think about the traditional separation of powers, we have the executive and the legislative and the judiciary, it creates this bureaucracy that kind of blends some of these powers to make sure that these statutes and these laws can be enforced and implemented. These programs can be run on a day-to-day basis. And so that was a magnificent, massive change. And many scholars have come to think about that as having amended the Constitution. Professor Paris also picked up, mentioned Reva Siegel's article, and she's also been a great friend, and she's one of the foremost experts on gender and constitutionalism and social movements, and the ERA in particular. And the idea here is the Equal Rights Amendment. That was a measure that it's really now, we're about a century from when it was first introduced in Congress, but it was a measure that was proposed in Congress in the early 1970s and eventually did not make it over the ratification deadline, even though it looked like in the start that it would. And so the idea there was to be a parallel to the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause in particular. Instead of thinking about race, though, it would focus on constitutional gender equality. And so it would guarantee men and women equal rights under the Constitution. And so instead of getting that, though, I said that came a little short. What we got was a few things going on. So we got the Supreme Court, most importantly, interpreting the 14th Amendment and the equal protection provision as protecting women. And so a lot of scholars argue that a bunch of what we were looking for in the Equal Rights Amendment, we got through that. We also got a bunch of ERAs in the state amendments at the time, and we got some really powerful statutes during the Civil Rights era that also included women, most notably the Civil Rights Act. And so that barred discrimination on the basis of sex. So we got a lot of what the ERA sought to accomplish. And so this sounds great, and it is great. But the biggest problem, I'd say, is that these aren't permanent. And we're starting to see that now. As far as the ERA is concerned, we start to see that a little earlier, and we could have gotten just a glimpse of that from an interview from Justice Scalia, when he was once asked if the Constitution requires protection for women. And he said, can it allow for it? Sure. But does it mandate it? No. And the reason why it doesn't mandate it is because there is no principle, no ERA in the Constitution that is there to require that. And so if the main force of equal protection on the basis of gender and sex is coming through interpretation of the 14th Amendment, and you get new courts thinking about the 14th Amendment more restrictively, then you don't get the full benefit of a textual amendment. And we can think about the same thing as far as the New Deal shift goes, right? We're starting to see what Steve Bannon called the deconstruction of the administrative state. So what we're seeing is all of these big agencies that had become so integral to how we live our lives and support ourselves, everything running from Social Security to the EPA, these agencies are being decimated. They're being decimated on the one hand by the political branches because they're not being funded and supported in the way that they should be, but they're being decimated by the Supreme Court too, right? And we have a bunch of the unelected members of the judiciary saying that they don't have the power to do this, or Congress did not think about this because this was a major question, or this is blurring too much of the three different types of power: executive power, legislative power, and judicial power. And so that's unconstitutional. And so I would say there's other reasons, but I would say the biggest reason is that these informal amendments are not permanent, and we can't guarantee on it. And so if we had instead seen these enshrined in the Constitution, now it's anyone's guess how a conservative Supreme Court would be interpreting them, but at least there would be a basis for them to believe that what they're doing is not in the spirit or in the text of the Constitution.
I guess I would just add to that our Constitution is hard to change, and we can get into why that happened. But that because it's hard to change, it would have crumbled a long time ago if the courts couldn't keep evolving it to keep up with the times. So we sort of describe it as there's sort of these slow changes that happen in these quiet periods, and the history of it has been amendments in a short period of time, in a 10-year period, and then 50, 60 years of no amendments, and then amendments again. And it's just like the pressure builds until there's almost like an earthquake with the shifting tectonic plates. And that's one way to think about it. But you would need those little pressure releases all along the way. And Wilfred's quite right that, we talk in the book about pivotal moments, that like the road not taken. And so, in the New Deal, as I mentioned in the beginning, Roosevelt's decision was a sensible one, and it and he, to his credit, basically used it to this idea that, when we talk about this revolution of 1837, it was really more of a restoration. It was basically restoring the framers' vision, because one of the things that's happened over the years is that there was a fight over the Constitution between people that wanted a strong national government and anti-federalists who basically feared the power of a strong national government. The anti-federalists lost. They entered into American society, participated in the government, but they succeeded over most of American history, their intellectual heirs, in pretending that they won, and pretending that the federal government is weak. And now we're at this pivot point where we have a court that is the most conservative since that court of the 9 old men that Roosevelt fought. And they're already talking about reviving the doctrines that Roosevelt fought against. So stay tuned for that. The one other thing I'll say, though, is that the informal, again, we couldn't have survived without this kind of informal change. But there's a value to the formal change that goes beyond actually winning an amendment. That when activists put themselves to the long-term strategy of winning amendments, they're engaging in a form of democratic participation. They're talking to people. They're going to state legislators. They're going to members of Congress. And that's what changes the conversation. It wasn't an accident that the court started being suddenly found that women were protected in the Constitution when they hadn't for 200 years. And the reason they did was because of all the talk in the air of the ERA, and women's rights were brought to the forefront. So, I wouldn't want to rely solely on the informal change for those reasons.
Well, thank you. So I was planning to give you a hard time about your interpretation of New Deal, but I'm gonna stay my own hand here. And we do have 2 student questions, so I'm very happy about that. I'm going to call on them and ask them to unmute to ask their question, or if you prefer, I can ask it. But the first one is from Ayman Elkshawi. Ayman, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you for choosing me. My question is, if the Constitution would be completely remade today, what would you 2 add to it, and how would you future-proof it for the future generations? So like there wouldn't be as much confusion as there is today.
Now you have a magic wand. Go ahead.
Well, and thank you, Amy. That's a really good question. I mean, frankly, personally, I would be very fearful of trying to rewrite the Constitution. A lot of academics, spend time really kind of imagining it, and it's a great thought exercise. And I could imagine a much better Constitution. I have a hard time imagining the process where we get it. In an age of Twitter and special interest and corporations with vast amounts of money that did not exist in 1787, I would worry what came out of that. Having said that, if I could add one change, and this is something we talk about in the book, it was to basically revisit the disastrous decision by the framers to not provide a right to vote. In the Constitution, it's remarkable that there is no affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. It's referenced in places, and you can't discriminate, against, women, for example, in the right to vote. But if there had been a universal right to vote, I think that would be a game-changing thing. On the subject of future-proofing it, Eamon, you get into a very interesting question, which is, how hard should it be to amend the Constitution? I mean, the reason it's as hard as it is was that the framers had to really hammer out a lot of difficult compromises. I mean, almost, quite a few of them left and discussed, but, the ones that stayed, none of them were really totally happy with the document, maybe some of the slave owning South, but, in general, most people felt that the compromises were hard, and they made it hard to amend the Constitution in part because they wanted to future-proof those changes. I mean, those compromises, and to avoid them being overridden too easily. I've come around in my own thinking that the future-proofing is dangerous. What we need is more ability in the future to make the Constitution more relevant to their time. So I would make it a little bit easier, but not too easy, to amend the Constitution as my second big change.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there just to one. I think it's important what John said, that future-proofing can be itself folly, right? Because who are we to know, right? The framers never envisioned the internet, right? And that causes a lot of the problems we're dealing with right now. The framers never envisioned a number of things that we have. They never envisioned a multiracial, multicultural democracy, right? There are just so many things that you couldn't have envisioned, and I think as sort of windows of technology shrink and what have you, it's really hard for us to envision what our successors will be thinking 200 years from now. And so the idea of future proofing, I think that there are some good values to be locked in. And so if I were to rewrite the Constitution, I would use some of the structures that we have in the current Constitution. I wouldn't use them all, and certainly some of the ones I would be tweaking. And so I think we really should be thinking about those that might have more enduring promise and more practical use over time. Maybe we would sort of elevate the ability to amend certain things and make certain things easier, depending on how universal and how enduring those ideas are. And as John said, I would also think about the amendment process as well. Perhaps, I mean, definitely lower the threshold from what it is now, but maybe also include other ways to amend the Constitution. So Akhil Amar talks about a national referenda, right? They didn't really think about direct democracy, and to the extent that they did at the founding era, they were very disparaging of it, but they didn't think that they really had the capacity for it either, and we do now. We know we do. And so, you know, if we really want to engage the people to know what their country and their Constitution and their government is going to be like, shape that, I think that all of the ideas that I would have for changing the Constitution would engage the people more in that way. And in terms of a substantive amendment, I would also, and I think John agrees with me here too, is thinking about restructuring the Supreme Court. And now that's a very sort of hot topic, I think, particularly in light of the Dobbs decision that reversed Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But even before that, though, I think we've had some big problems that have been exhibited in the modern Supreme Court. So, for example, it's not nearly as diverse as it should be, and we should not have less than 10 women and non-white men in the history of the Supreme Court on the Supreme Court. That's finally just happening, but still it's not enough. And so if we were to have term limits on the Supreme Court, we would be rotating in justices on a staggered basis, but a regular basis. Presidents would have appointments regularly. It might bring down the temperature of these confirmation wars, because everybody thinks of these justices as going to be there forever, and so they're choosing them younger and with less experience and things that we know less about them, so they're more of a black box. And two, with the expectation that they're going to give the Constitution the reading that is in line with the people who are appointing and approving them. And that may be the case, but we also see that the issues change over time too. And so I think that the more sort of infusions of new blood on the Supreme Court, reading this document that doesn't change often would be beneficial for us in many, many regards.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take them in order now. Mia Goldberg.
Yeah, I have.
Hi, how are you? So a couple of your questions have been answered, I think, but I'm gonna, you have a question about pre-commitment or locking in things against the future. You have a question about whether the Anti-Federalists were right to worry about the court and life tenure, and a question about constitutional language, which is interesting. So I'm going to leave it to you. Go ahead. Thank you for your questions, plural.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I'll start with the one you said was interesting. So do you think that the framers of the Constitution were clumsy or strategic or neither in their use of ambiguous text in the Constitution?
I'd say both. I think that, well, one, when they gathered in Philadelphia, this was not the first time that they gathered to discuss the flaws with the Articles of Confederation, which was the sort of proto-constitution that bound the colonies or states at that time beforehand, right? So they got together, and certainly they had thought about this. They had experiences under their own state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation, but using ambiguous and vague language can, one, just be sort of tactic, right? Keeping things strategically open so you can read into it as time and sort of evolution and experience requires. So, and the idea of due process, well, due process doesn't really mean anything unless we have some context. And so, you know, with certain things, it was a way to have some play in the joints, right, for the Constitution and for the way that everybody read it in the future, all the branches of the government, and indeed the people too. I also think it was a way to sort of pass the buck so they didn't have to negotiate hard issues. So some had firm beliefs about more precise language, but they could not get full agreement. And John noted this, right? At the end of the Constitutional Convention, nobody was happy with it for the most part. Certain people were happy with certain provisions. John mentioned members of the South being happy with the slave provisions, and indeed that's true. We saw their language going back to the conventions and talking about that, but they still had their gripes. Even the slave states, they wanted Black people to count for a whole person in terms of political power, while counting for no person in terms of their individual right to participate in the government, right? And so we saw examples of this in many ways, and in that way, they just could not agree on things. And so it would come to, you know, posterity to determine what these meant. And we saw them do this in other ways too. So for example, they passed the buck to the states in terms of determining voting laws for the most part. So you look at provisions of the Constitution, and they don't really spell out what you need to be a voter. They say, well, we look to the state constitution. And as we know today, we have 50 different state constitutions. And so what it means and how to become a voter means different things. And so they didn't have all the answers. They had some had really firm thoughts about this, but they wouldn't get them through. And, you know, at the end of the Constitution, it was Ben Franklin's speech who said, nobody's happy with this, but the fact that we accomplished something, it's great. And this is basically going to be a starting point.
Yeah, I want to just piggyback onto that to say, I mean, in a way, I'm not troubled by general provisions like equal protection of the laws, because it is allowed over time for that to include protection for LGBTQ people or protection for women, which wasn't expressly written in there. I want to talk about the clumsiness, though, because one of the themes that we have is the mistakes they made. I mean, the story of the Constitutional Convention is they had 4 months. They ended up fighting a lot about one big issue, which is how to represent states. And it's why we ended up with a Senate that gives every state the same suffrage. And so they had to rush through things. And so I'll give you 2 examples of mistakes that, you know, cried out for changing. One is they created a federal district for the government, the District of Columbia. They allowed Congress to create it. But when they talked about representation in the government, it was all through the states. So in other words, they didn't mean to disenfranchise the people of the District of Columbia, but they did by just not thinking about that. Another example, and this is it's almost, laughable, is, they created the presidency, and at the end they thought, oh, we need a vice president, right? And they hadn't thought it through. So they never said in the Constitution that if the president dies, the vice president becomes president. They had this vague language about the powers and devolving on this person. And so there was a real controversy the first time a president died. And John Tyler, the first person to, the first accidental president, just said, well, damn it, I'm president and I'm going to be the president. And there was a lot of controversy, but it was really for a long time that there was like an unsettled part of the law. So that's an important reason for amendments, is just to fix those human failings.
And Mia, I want to also John just brought up a good point about the clumsiness, because you had said that, but then there are also just things that might not have been clumsy, but really short-sighted, or just like, wow, how did you do that? And so I think the biggest example of that is the Electoral College. And so John mentioned, right, the idea about the presidency was difficult. There was this idea that we didn't, the separation of powers and the way we think about that was based on all these historical ideas, but the presidency was supposed to be have vigor and sort of have some monarchical sort of ideas, but be able to like execute the laws in a way that required expediency, in the way that you wouldn't get that sort of governance from a multi-member body like Congress or even the Supreme Court. And so this president, they decided all of this stuff, but they didn't really think about it too much beyond that. If you look at Article 2 of the Constitution, it's very short. It's very short. Compare that to Article 1, which talks about Congress and lays out all of the powers of Congress and what it can and cannot do. The Article 2 is very short, but Article 2 does talk about how we get a president, and that was even really haphazard. So we have the Electoral College. People know the Electoral College to some extent. They know it mostly when it fails, when it sort of misaligns with the popular vote. But the Electoral College, even the first couple times, really didn't work the way they planned out. So there's this idea that you'd have these electors who were supposed to be independent from politics and sort of exercising their judgment. Well, that failed really quickly. There was this idea, for all of the talk that these framers had, that they didn't like political parties and factions, we saw that happen very, very early on, right? Even outside of the Constitutional Convention, you immediately have the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And if that's not a faction, I don't know what is. But that quickly evolves into these political parties. And then you get the failure of the Electoral College. One, it fails in the way that because the original design gave the runner-up the vice presidency. And so you can think if you have two warring factions, your first place winner and your second place, they're going to be on different sides of the aisle, and it does not make sense.
Imagine if Trump was vice president now. That's what would have happened under the original design of the Constitution.
That is what happened, right? Like that's what happened. Yeah,
I'm saying that it would have been
John Adams,
certainly very interesting.
Thomas Jefferson, and that's what was going on. So you have that failure, but then it also failed in general because of the way that they designed it, and they. It was supposed to be the person getting the most number of votes becomes the president, second number of votes becomes vice president, but they had them voting on like one ballot for all of these offices. And so there was a tie. And they thought about that, and then that would go to Congress. And it was just like such a slapdash design that had to be amended with the 12th Amendment. And John and I know both firmly believe that it needs to be amended again and even eradicated, to just think about how we elect the leader of this country with such a vast sort of portfolio of work and a massive job that the framers could have never envisioned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you, mate.
I am going to continue to go in order. I don't want to detain you folks for too long. I'm sure that dinner and family await. So the next question, just going in order, James Robles, if you want to unmute and ask your question, I think it's an interesting one in relation to the book. I'm gonna combine. Actually, if you let me go ahead. I'm gonna throw another one after this one. So let's hear two together. Okay, go ahead.
All right, perfect. So to what extent does or did social movements and social pressure affect the court's decision making and decisions on cases throughout history?
That's a good question, James. Thank you. Absolutely, public opinion and pressure affects the courts. I mean, the framers tried very hard to design a system with an independent judiciary that could withstand pressure. I mean, they, in the 1700s, the judiciary in England was evolving to this rule of life tenure. And the reason for life tenure wasn't just to give someone this cushy perk for the rest of their life. It was basically to make sure that they couldn't be fired because of their rulings. But the colonial courts in the colonies were not independent. They were constantly overridden by the colonial governors and King George. In the Declaration of Independence, one of the complaints about King George is that he made the courts dependent on his will alone. So to correct for that, they basically created a system of life during good tenure, which means life tenure. If you want to stay that long, there's also a provision that it prevents a reduction in pay for judges, which would be one like obvious way to retaliate. Having said that, throughout our history, there has been huge amounts of criticism and social pressure. It doesn't always affect the court. I mean, the court, there were many people outraged by, the slavery, but the didn't stop the court from, ruling in Dred Scott that Black people have no rights under the Constitution and that slavery is absolutely legitimate. But if you look at the last 50 years, starting in the period with throughout most of our history, the courts have been a fairly conservative, if not reactionary, institution. The big exception was from the 50s to the 70s, the era of the Warren Court, which is an important and transformational moment in our country. And people my age who, I went to law school in the 80s. We had this idea that the courts were this place where you had a shot at really advancing rights. And we, of course, we have in areas like marriage equality, but in fact, through most of our history has been quite the opposite. And starting with the Warren Court, conservatives in this country really perfected a kind of a message of attacking courts, as activist judges, judicial tyrants. Basically, anytime there's a ruling that they don't like, it's activism, it's illegitimate, it's that kind of tearing down. And you can't tell me that doesn't have an effect on judges, even with life tenure. And now we're going to see the opposite. We're now progressives are going to be the ones complaining about the courts. And I think they're going to take a lot from the playbook of the conservatives and be far more full-throated in their attacks on this new right-wing court.
Yeah, and let me just sort of add. I think Justice Kennedy is an interesting example. Anthony Kennedy, who stepped down and was replaced recently. The sort of impact of like outside of the court had on him is really interesting. One, he was someone who had never ruled in favor of an affirmative action decision until there was a firm sort of decision in place. So his was the Texas decision. I raised that because we're going to have another affirmative action case up at the Supreme Court, and there's going to be a decision in June. I guarantee you it'll be in June because the justices don't want to deal with whatever blowback they're going to get. But there's another case, and he had never ruled on the side of affirmative action until there was some stability. But something he did rule, he was the deciding vote in a lot of the LGBT cases. And the idea and the talk was that, he was surrounded by a lot of folks from the LGBT community, and that had an impact on him. And the work that was happening in social movements in the LGBT movement really impacted him. And so, like there's only so much you can tell from anecdote, but that does have an influence. But I think even as importantly, at least for our book, and even more importantly, is the role that social movements have had on amending the Constitution. And that's huge. We would not have a bunch of these amendments without social movements. So abolition, probably the earliest social movement we can think of in this country, right? Without the abolition, we would not have had the Civil War amendments and everything that came from that. And again, if you think about the 14th Amendment, groups that were not thought about as getting benefits from the Equal Protection Clause and due process, they're now being embraced by that. They've been embraced by that century afterwards, right? So abolition, the suffrage movement for women's suffrage, that started early on, and that happened that was happening around the same time as abolition, or at sort of later stage, the later part of the suffrage movement. And a lot of the women who were working in the suffrage movement had also gotten their chops in the abolitionist movement. Same thing with the temperance movement and how we got the Prohibition Amendment. Again, a bad amendment in the end, but it was a sort of a loftier idea and thought it was doing something better, and in fact may have been doing something better, or at least the aims of it were better at the time. That is to deal with alcoholism and abuse and absenteeism and the things that came along during that time. So we see all of those things were big social movements that changed the Constitution. And that's just talking about a few of the formal amendments. We talked about informal amendments, and we can think about all of the massive changes that occurred in the 20th century, and that definitely came out of civil rights movements and the movements that were related to that too. So social movements impact the court. The court is typically, as John said, behind the rest of the political branches and certainly the country in terms of its progress. But social movements have really been the fuel that have driven Article 5 amendments, formal amendments, and the changes to our Constitution.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna exercise some discretion and ask a particular question. I guess Nathan Bogomolny, if you want to unmute and ask your question, and this is just or let me pair. All right, go ahead. It's good for you to actually ask your question. It's an interesting follow-up to what we were just talking about. And I don't know, another 5 minutes, guys.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of good segue. So my question was kind of like, are amendments simply just this thing that like we need to work as hard as we can to pass them? Or has there been something that like really worked in the past, some kind of like messaging or strategy or whatever that we need to relearn as a country again?
Yeah. That's a great question, Nathan, and it's really one of the important themes of our book. I mean, by telling these stories, you're really talking about the moments when things change, and we quote a scholar named Vicki Jackson who says that the belief that it's impossible or unbelievably difficult to amend the Constitution is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it means that people don't even take the first step, and the reality is that it's not an easy process, but that the people who have been rewarded in our history with in social movements, or the politicians who make that happen, are often in like John the Baptist in the desert, like they're by themselves, or there's not that many people with them. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So the women's suffrage movement, they tried to be included in the Reconstruction amendments to say, again, like, let's have a universal right to vote. Let's not just give the vote to Black men. And they sometimes said that in with terrible racial language, but in any event, they realized they were not going to get that. They tried in the courts. They tried just to show up and vote in 1872. A lot of them got arrested. They lost in the courts, and it was only then that they realized that the only path forward was the long and arduous path of winning an amendment. And it's not. I mean, it's a daunting story, because it took them another 40 years to get it. But they had to just keep doing it. And sometimes it's not that long. But for example, a lot of the progressive era amendments were sparked by a flowering of populist and progressive energy, and after the election of 1892. And there was this sort of sense that we're going to have, and Congress passed an income tax, and they moved ahead on reform of the Senate. The Supreme Court overturned the income tax, and we ended a long period, dry spell. But that's when people just kept at it. And the only thing I'll say, I guess, is that we become, as a country, I think, focused a lot on short-term efforts. In business, it's always the next quarter. It's if you get a grant as a nonprofit, it's like you have to show you got something done this year. This is a long-term effort. And all we're arguing is that there needs to be a greater awareness that there is something to be gained by engaging in the long-term effort, that even if you don't win the amendment this year or next year or in 5 years, you are talking about the issue you care about. You are winning converts. You are taking it to the arena of politics. You are beginning to make things happen. That's the story of it. But usually it takes a moment of desperation rather than a great message or talking point, which I like to think about that. But it's usually a moment of desperation when people feel where else can we go? And I would submit that with the Supreme Court is not going to be a place where people can win reform. With our polarized politics, people I think are going to say, like, let's push for an amendment.
Yeah, and just to and John left off about the Supreme Court, and what I'd like to say is, like, one thing that we tried to do, and at the end of the book, and I'm not going to give it all away because hopefully you guys will go out and read it. It's a great read. But one thing we try to do is, like, in light of all the history that we presented up front, what are some ways that we know we're ready for amendments, right? And so one of the things we want to learn is we've seen some patterns, these sort of catalysts, or what we're calling green shoots, these indicators that tell us that we're about ready for some amendments, and we're seeing some of those now. So I will give one example. Again, I'm not going to give away all the goodies, but just because John talked about the Supreme Court, one of the catalysts that we've seen are Supreme Court decisions that are universally reviled, right? And so we've seen this on a number of occasions, and indeed, overturning or reversing a Supreme Court decision is one of the primary reasons why people amend the Constitution. And so you can think about Dred Scott, right? If we didn't have Dred Scott, we may not have had that 13th or 14th Amendment, certainly not at that time. We can think about the Pollock Farmer case, which is about the Supreme Court said that there's no right for Congress to pass laws imposing an income tax. And we got a response to that says, yes, Congress can. We can think about a number of other amendments that happened during the 20th century, including in the Civil Rights era. The amendment that gave us the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age. It was this series of really difficult opinions, fractured decision in the Supreme Court saying, yeah, well, Congress can legislate the voting age for federal elections, but not for state elections. And so you could imagine coming to states saying, well, you're going to have to run two different sets of elections with two different rolls of voters and two different regulations, even though you're going to have like this one election day, which is costly, burdensome, annoying, and doesn't make sense. And so actually ameliorating or mitigating the fallout from terrible Supreme Court decisions is one of the primary reasons. And so if people see that, maybe that they'll think more of decisions like Dobbs. Maybe they'll think more about decisions like Citizens United. Citizens United being probably the most recent decision that has universal sort of distaste from Republicans and Democrats and independents alike. Everybody hates that decision. And so it's just like a few corporatist sort of greed and politicians who are sort of held up by infusions of money in their campaign coffers that like appreciate Citizens United. Everybody else think it distorts the way policy is made and it corrupts our politicians. And so what we need to do is, one, be patient. Two, actually get the work going, like John says, because this is not a short-term game, it's a long-term view for amendments. And three, look for these indicators showing us that, look, the reasons why you're complaining are not wrong. And people complained at these different times where it looked like the nation was really going to fall apart, where we had a civil war, where we like almost didn't have a constitution, where people were beaten bloody in the streets and on the foots of bridges in the civil rights era. These were terrible times where it looked like our country was going to fall apart. And we may be at one of those points now, which is one of the reasons why John and I wrote this book. And hopefully you'll find it enjoyable and interesting and take some nuggets for it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're going to leave it there. There are several other really good questions. I apologize to those of you who've asked them. I've saved the chat. If you're my students, I have it. And if you do get the book, there's even more to learn than we covered tonight. I think a lot more. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but there's a couple pages about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a workaround for the Electoral College that everyone should know about because we can then mobilize for it. Somebody should come up with a pithier way to capture that idea than
yes.
National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, but
that's for sure.
And I could go on and on. I do think I just want to conclude by saying I don't often change my mind. I don't know about you, but you certainly have moved me in the direction of, at the very least, these efforts can be mobilizing in a way that other efforts maybe wouldn't be so much, right? So thank you both.
It was great. It was really great being here. Thanks for having us. And if I could just say one last little thing, which is, the last wave of amendments happened when I was a kid. And throughout my entire life, it's been basically this long dry spell. But in your lifetimes, the Constitution will surely be amended. And so I hope I just, this is going to be for your future. So I do hope that that's something that you care about and that you can speak out for and demand the kind of change and the kind of constitution that fits your lifetimes in the 21st century.
Okay, wonderful. And the book again is The People's Constitution, New Press. You can go to the New Press website, or Amazon is now in the link, and a student actually did that for me. I apologize for not doing it myself, but really super book, super presentations, and I thank you both again. So I'm gonna end now, and I will be in touch with some follow-up matters, right?
Thank you very
Thank you,
much,
everyone.
for having us.
Thank you.
Such a
Thank
great
you
night.
so much. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you for coming.